And we're live. Okay. We're going to wait till several people come in. As you come in, you can, I believe, start chatting. Oh no, the chat is disabled. Yeah, I think I did that on purpose. I'm not just sure. Let me try this again. Yeah, there's no chat on this thing. Okay. So I'm going to wait till more people jump in. And okay, the chat is activated, so people can chat now. Let's see here. Yep, there we go. So as you come in, say hi on the chat so we can see who's available. Make sure you guys can hear me. Okay, yeah, you can hear me. So as you come in, say hi on the chat so we can see who's available. Make sure you guys can hear me. Yeah, we're already started. Waiting for people to jump in. As I'm waiting for people to jump in, I'm just getting stuff together here. If you jumped into the chat, just say hi, play nice there. There will be a moderator, so make sure your conversations are. Okay. So whoever is online, just say hi so I can say hi back. So as you jump in, say hi so I can see who's here. Okay, Natalia is on board. Hi guys, thank you so much for being part of this. We're gonna start in a few minutes. I'm just waiting to see if more people jump in. If not, we'll just work with you guys because it's important. It's important to know who's here, but I really want to make sure most people are available. We're gonna give them a couple of moments. Can you hear me okay? There's a bit of a delay from when I speak and when I see where you chat because it takes a moment for you to see what I'm saying. So if you see that delay, don't worry about it. Okay, perfect. So Fernando says they can hear me, so that's good. Waiting for more people to jump in, like I said. Have my camera here for you guys because we're ready to rock and roll. Okay. Like I said, those people that are just jumping in, say hi in the chat so we can start. It is currently 11:06. I'm gonna start. I'm gonna give people 4 more minutes, or else we're gonna start. In the meantime, say hello to the people that are on the chat, saying hi to Natalia and her family, and to Fernando, which are online. Currently, say I have 5 people online, so that's awesome. And we're gonna start in any moment here. And David is online. Awesome, David. Thank you so much for joining in and being part. Say hi to the rest of the gang there. I'm gonna start in 3 more minutes here. Sorry, I forgot to drink my vitamin this morning, so I'm gonna do it now. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. It's kind of weird. I know it's kind of like a silence here, but just waiting for more people to jump in. And we're going to start in 2 minutes here. So if you're just jumped in, according to, we have about 7 viewers. Just say hi on the chat so we know you are here. And everybody can, it's like in school, raise your hand to know that you're here. Present. From my understanding, I can be heard clearly, so that's good. Fix my neck there before my mother jumps online and sees me. Then she'll be like giving her comments later. Okay, we're gonna start in 2 minutes here. Once I start, I'm just gonna go through the classes and the explanation of things. You can leave comments, and as they pop up, it takes a moment for me to see them as I'm explaining, so I might get to you after I finish the subject, but I'll trace back to the chat to help you out. So don't think I'm ignoring you or ignoring your chat. It's just that there's a delay between what I say and what goes out there, what you see when you type it and I receive it. So Just want to make sure you understand that, guys, so nobody gets upset. I'll try to answer as many questions as possible as they come in. Feel free to ask as many questions as you like. We're here to help each other and grow. Okay, so let's start here. So, hi guys, welcome to my online course of photography. My name is Mario Ramirez. I've been a photographer for over 10 years now. This is what I do. This is, as they say, how I pay the mortgage. Photography is, for me, not only my work, but it started off as a hobby, and as it developed from a hobby, it developed into a passion, and from there it became a work. And so I believe I'm one of the luckiest persons in the world, because I get to do as a job what I enjoy doing as fun. I hope you understand what I mean. I love photography and I love videography. I have a passion for it. And it seems I'm good at it because people are willing to pay me to do photos for them. So that's a plus. And I want to share some of the knowledge that I have gained throughout the years with you guys. Photography is art, but at the same time, it's science and it's practice. You have to have a certain, how can I say, you have to be a bit artful with it to be creative, and that's great. And it's a great creative outlet. But at the same time, you have to learn the math part of it, the science part of it, which is interesting to me. And that's why it became a hobby, because I was more interested in the science part of it and the math part of it. And from there, I grew into the art part of it. So you understand what I mean when I start explaining the different things. Photography is basically painting with light. That's a famous phrase that is said, is painting with light. It's capturing the light of one moment, of one instant, and capturing it, exposing it into film, and nowadays into digital medium. There's a great experiment that are these days interesting for you guys to do if you have children at home, and especially that you're going to be spending so much time, and it's creating what is called a cámara oscura, dark room. I'm going to see if I can find a small video so I can spend the link on it. Basically, you can turn any room into a camera, and it's pretty cool. There's a whole bunch of videos online on how to do it, and you just take your room and you make sure it's pitch dark. And when I mean pitch dark, I mean like there's no light whatsoever. You close all the doors, and you take all the doors and you wrap it in make sure in like plastic bags, black plastic bags, so no light will come in. So it's like pitch black. I'm talking about nothing. And once you do that, you just make a little opening on the window, and opposite of that, you put a blank piece of paper, white, and you can actually see the image. I'll show you. Here's a little video of that, and I'm gonna paste it for you guys to see it. Hold on.
I can't believe it. That child really was raised by wolves.
Sorry about that. I don't know why it's giving me.
That's her right there.
Oh my gosh. No. I can't believe how easy it was to save with Geico.
Geico. Believe it.
camera obscura is a dark room, any size, that has an opening looking out into the world. Through that opening, an upside down image of the outside actually gets projected on the back of that room. It's a very simple physical process.
Okay, so you saw that. It's you can do that in any room in your home, as long as you have a window on one side, and on the other side, just a wall. And if you don't have a wall, just take one of those foam cord boards and put it down, and you can project that. It's a fun experiment. I've done it once, and it was really, really fun. But you have to make sure the room is pitch black. And basically, that's how a camera works. Is exactly like that. It takes the image from the outside, the light goes through the lens into the film, and in our case now, the sensor, which is the chip inside the camera, that converts this light back into the image. Okay, so in this case with the camera, kind of backwards here. Okay, light comes here through the lens, as if this would be the room. It's all pitch black, and it converges to the back of the room back here, where the sensor would be. I'm going to show you. The sensor would be back there, behind that mirror. And I'll explain that mirror in a moment. So light goes through the lens, you can see there. And that's how a photo is taken. It sounds very simple, and actually it is pretty simple, but it's just the converting that light into something that we can see and take is where the process is. No questions? Okay, perfect. So a camera is basically a cámara oscura, a dark room. Now, when it comes to taking photos, you want to what is called expose an image. That comes from when we used to use film. The light would be painted onto a piece of film, and that would be the exposed image. I'm going to get a piece of film to show you what it looks like. Oops, sorry about that, guys. This is an older type film. Oops, I don't want to damage it because I already took photos here. They'll get damaged if light sees them. Hold on. Okay, perfect. I don't want to damage. I shouldn't put this one back here. This is not the one I want to show. Okay, it's in here in the pack. I can take it out, but I don't want to right now. Damage it. Film is in here, the old type of film. Put it like this. And that goes into, let me show you this older type camera that I have. This is a Bronica GS1. It's a medium format camera and uses film. The film goes back here. Let's see if I have it. Okay, I can take it out. Perfect. Okay, perfect. The film goes back there. be here. Give me 1 second, guys. Trying to figure. Okay, here we go. The lens. This is the viewfinder. Sorry. And this is the cámara oscura. This is the back where the film would be when it takes the photo. And actually I can show you. Let's see if you can see it. There you go. It opened. So the lens would be here. Light would come in. The dark room. The film will be back here. And it'll take the photo. So you can see how photography is in film. And this is the exact same thing that happened in modern cameras. The only difference is it's instead of film, it's a digital sensor. Okay. Let me show you here. Okay, see it's covered. And when you take the photo, it goes up to expose the film, and then it should shut down again. It's not doing it because it's all taken apart. And this exact process happens inside of this camera, as in this older camera, and even the older ones before that. Okay, so now we know how cameras work. Hope there's any. Hi Desiree. Yeah, Natalia, it's pretty cool once you see it that way. If I'm boring you guys, let me know so I can be more active here in the chat. Okay, I think I'll do this, put it here. Okay. So now we know what a camera is and how photos are, what photos really are. They're just painting, just the light coming in, impressed into the film or the digital sensor. Now we're gonna see how we do that, how we can actually create the proper photo, the proper exposure. Okay. When you take a photo, as I said, light comes into the sensor and you create the image. There are three things that you control in order to create the proper photo, what we call the proper exposure. Those three things are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We call that the triangle of exposure, and I'll show you. Okay, we have the aperture, which I'll call AP. We have the shutter speed, which I'll call SS, and we have the ISO. They're all three parts, we would say, like a stool. You know how stools have three legs, and if one is shorter than the other, it's wobbly. That's the same thing with a photo. If one is not compatible with the other, your image will either be or too bright or too dark, or too blurry or not blurry enough. you need to learn how to know and control what is each one to create the proper photo in camera. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, you can just take the photo and correct it in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever program in the computer you want now. And that's true. But the value in getting it as correct as possible in camera is very, very important. And the reason why you have to learn these three things and make the photo as proper in camera as possible is because there's this thing called dynamic range. Our eyes are so much more advanced than any camera developed. I know it's a lot of people, for them it's hard to understand that, and they think, well, but cameras, they do these amazing things and they take these amazing photos, but so far there's no camera that can compare to your eyes and how much differences it can see from light to dark. That difference between dark and light and from light to dark is called dynamic range. A camera, for example, can see this much light. Sorry, my thing is backwards here. Sorry, I gotta do this mirror. Really. Okay. This much light and this much dark. But that's the camera. But your eyes, can see that much more. That's why a good example of this is, and a lot of people ask me, when they take a photo in a really bright day with their cell phone or with the camera or whatever, in a really bright day with the real bright blue skies, and they stand in front of the camera to take the photo, and the sky is all blue and all the colors and everything, they see it, and they see the mountains and all these colors and all these different tones. They take the photo and they see the person in front dark, yet they see them with their eyes. They see them perfectly. They see the person in front of them perfectly. They see the sky perfectly. They see the mountains perfectly. But when they take the photo, either the person is dark and the sky is good, or the sky is so bright and the person looks good. That's because of dynamic range, because the camera cannot go and see as dark as your eyes or as bright as your eyes at the same time. That's why it's important to learn how to control the camera's settings with the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed to make these differences between dark and light to fit within the range of the camera. Any questions, feel free to ask on the chat. Okay, so what are these three things? Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's start with the aperture. Let me bring out this lens. Okay, so you see the lens. You see how wide it is and you can see through it. Let's see if I can. Okay. So you see how wide it is? I'm going to change the aperture, and I want you to see something. And you see that? Try to focus it this way. You see how much it closes and opens inside? just like an iris in your eyes. As light comes in, can open and close. That's what's called the aperture. The aperture is how wide that circle is within the lens in reference to the lens itself. And now I ask you, if the hole is wider, what happens with the light? When the hole is like this, try that. More light comes in. Let me do it myself on here. Let me show you. More light comes in because it's really wide. If I close the hole, you see, less light comes in. Less light comes in. So, what does that tell you? That tells you that by controlling how open or closed that hole is, you can control how much light comes into the camera and how much light is exposed into the sensor. And that's what's called an aperture. So you're controlling the light by how open or closed that is. How open or closed that light is, the aperture is. You're going to control how much light comes into your camera. So the wider, more light; the closer, less light. And why would you want to do that? Well, if you're taking a photo outside in the sun, you would want to close that hole to control that much light coming into the camera, so you won't overexpose or create an image that's too bright. Because remember, the sensor can only see so much dark to light difference, not like your eyes. But even your eyes do that, and you can do that experiment. We've all done it. You take a little flashlight, you go to your eyes, and you see. The doctors, they do that to see how much your pupils open. So when you go into the dark room, your pupils open more, so more light can come in. They can see more. And when you go outside, they close up a little bit, so they can control how much light hits your retina, hits your sensor per se in your eyes. So that's aperture. That's one way to control light for controlling a photo. The next one, which is the shutter speed. As I explained to you earlier, this is the camera oscura, right? You see that closing up there? That's the shutter. In this case, for this camera, that's the shutter. This back here, that's the shutter. When I take a photo, it opens. Sorry. When I take a photo, okay, it's gonna open. You see? And then when it's ready, it's gonna close. Take a photo, it opens, and it closes. Opens and closes. Now, depending on how fast it opens and closes, is the speed of the shutter. That's what's called a shutter speed. Why would you want it to close and open faster or slower? The slower it opens, the more time light is hitting the sensor. The more time light is hitting the film. And if you think about it, the more time light is hitting it, the more it gets exposed to light, the more light it sees. You can do that with your eyes. Well, it's not really good to try it with the eyes because it's so fast that it's not. You can't compare it to pupils in that sense because it's just so fast. The best way, and what I've learned it to be is like the blinds on a window. You open the blinds real quick and real fast, like open, close, and light comes into the room. You can more or less see what's in there, but you can't really see what it is. But light came in, and you did see the flash of light. If you open the blinds more time, more light goes into the room, and you can see more of what's in the room. And that's exactly what happens with the sensor. The faster you open and close the shutter, the more light hits the sensor, and the more of what's out there it could see and it could capture. Now, each one of these parts of the triangle to create the proper photo has its own particular effect on the photo itself. And I'll get to that in a moment. So, aperture is how open or closed the lens is to bring in light. Shutter is how quickly or how slowly it lets light into the sensor. What is ISO? ISO comes from the film days. I hope you can see this. This film says 400. ISO 400. ISO was a measurement of how sensitive the film was to light based on the chemicals that they put in it. So there was these certain chemicals to help the film develop into the photo. The more sensitive these chemicals are to light, the higher the ISO, to make it that with less light, it could see more, it could capture more. So an ISO of 100 meant that the chemical was, let's say, 100% of this chemical. 200 was double the amount of chemical. 400, double of that. So the more chemical it would have, the higher the ISO, and the higher the ISO meant it was more sensitive to light. Nowadays we use digital, so there is no chemicals in the film. It's because it's electronic. But a good way to that you can compare it and why it stayed as that is that ISO is the amount of electricity, because this is a computer basically, and it has a battery, so it uses electricity. Small amounts, but there is electricity going through. So the camera controls how much electricity hits the sensor at any given time to make it more or less sensitive to light. And that ISO is the amount of electricity the sensor receives in order to convert that light into the image. The lower the number, the less electricity. The higher the number, the more electricity. Mind you, all these things that I'm explaining to you is the way I learned it. You can probably go online, and there's so many material out there and so many ways to compare how one thing is to another. And I ask you to go and find out for yourself because it's good. But the way I learned it was that ISO is compared to the amount of electricity the sensor receives to boost the image, to make it more sensitive to light, to capture the image. The higher the ISO, the stronger the sensor is in electricity wise, so it's more sensitive to light. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive. So we go back to the triangle of exposure. Aperture, how open or closed the lens is. Shutter speed, how fast or how slow the sensor receives the light. So aperture, how much light is received. Shutter, how fast or how slow the light is received. And ISO, how sensitive the sensor is to electricity, how sensitive it is to the light. So let's review. Give me 1 second here. Okay. Aperture is how much light is going through the lens. Shutter, how fast the sensor sees this light. So how fast and how long, how fast and how long, how fast and how long. And ISO is how sensitive the sensor is to light to be able to create the image. Okay. So that is the triangle of exposure. That's how we decide how we want to control the camera to create the image that we like. Now, I told you that each one of these has a certain effect on the image and how it's created. So based on how open or closed the lenses can determine one thing, how fast or how slow the shutter opens or closes depends on another thing, and how much ISO or less ISO depends on another. And I'll explain, and I'll start with the shutter speed. What effect does the shutter speed have on the image, on the photo itself? We have the camera, correct? It closes. You take the photo. It opens and then it closes. The faster this opening and closing happens, I'm like John Cena, you can't see me. The faster this opening and closing happens determines how much light hits the sensor, but also determines how fast the images that are in front of the sensor are copied onto the sensor itself. So this affects movement. If you're taking photos of moving objects and the object is here, the shutter opens, and then the object is here and then it closes, you're going to capture the image as it moved from here to here. And that's where you get that motion blur. When you ask yourself, why do you take a photo and you see kind of like a ghost trail of a person, or a ghost trail of a light, or a ghost trail of an object? Is because when the shutter opened, the object was here, and when it closed, the object was here. So that much information is copied onto the sensor. If you want the image to be static and not have that ghost trail, have that movement, you want a faster shutter speed. The faster the shutter speed, the less time there is for the object to move in front of the sensor for it to be copied over. So if you have a shutter speed of 1 second, Let's try that. 1. You saw all that movement? You can see from those two lines. 1. That much movement is copied. But if you have a shutter speed of a half a second, 1, it only move. You only have that much of the movement. If you have half of that, it'll only be this much. If you only have half of that, it'll be this much. And half of that, I just can't move my finger to that space because it's so small. So you want to reduce the shutter speed to the fastest as possible when you're taking photos of moving objects, of people, of cars, of birds, of animals, anything where there's movement that you want to make the person clear, sharp, or the object clear and sharpened because it's moving. You want to put that shutter speed as fast as possible. In the cameras, you have shutter speeds that go 1 second, half a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/60th of a second, 1/120th of a second, 1/1000th of a second. So you have 1 second, half of that is half a second, half of that is a quarter of a second, half of that, so on, so on, so forth. So that's how you see, when you see these numbers in your camera, 1 over something, 1 over something, 1 over something, that's the shutter speed. And the bigger the number is on the bottom, the faster the shutter speed is. Now, on your cell phone, most cell phones, well, if not all, especially not the newer ones, that's the camera, right? Right there. They have something that's called a fixed aperture. Fixed aperture means that it won't open or close more than what it already is. It's already at that number. So how a cell phone, so in the triangle of exposure, since that part is fixed, the only part the cell phone can move to create a proper exposure is either the shutter speed or the ISO. The aperture is fixed. Some cameras have on their camera app the part that you can change the ISO. I'm trying to see if this app does. I know iPhones, I believe they do. So go into your iPhone camera app and look for that part of the shutter speed, and you can play around with it. You take a photo at different intervals of ISO, of shutter speed, sorry, and you can see how you can blur movement and not blur movement. It's really fun to try. So give that a try, guys. The shutter speed. So that's how you control that part of the triangle of the shutter speed, is with the shutter speed. The other one, the ISO, that makes it more the sensor more sensitive to light. So with less light, it can capture more. So you won't have to go too low on your shutter speed to capture the image. What is the drawback, or what is the effect of the ISO on the photo itself? Is the higher the ISO, the more you have to boost the sensor, give it electricity to create the image properly, the more noise the image will have. What is noise? Noise is grain developed on the film or on the image itself from artificially boosting the image. back to the film days. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the film would be to light, but at the same time, the grainier the image would be. That's why when you see those old films, especially of locations where it was night, they look very grainy because they had to use very sensitive paper or film, and it would be very grainy. It would have a lot of grain. Nowadays and digitally, that grain is produced by artificially boosting the image, boosting the electricity. So if you take a photo with the ISO of 100, it's what we like to call cleaner. And if you take the ISO higher, let's say to 2000, you would see some grain in the image. That is why on cell phones, especially when you take photos at night, you see the photos and you're like, oh, this photo looks bad. It looks very grainy. It looks like it has little like pixelations, little like dust in it, and that's because the cell phone has to boost the electricity to the sensor to get the image based on because it's night. So technically, you would want to take the photo as low as possible when it comes to ISO, so it can produce less noise. The more modern the camera is, the more ISO you can put to it, and it'll create less noise because it has better computers inside. Because cameras have a computer inside. They have a chip inside, which is a mini computer, and it can take this ISO and do all these algorithm things and make the noise much, much less. But still, you want to take the photo with at least the least amount of ISO possible. So we have the shutter speed, can control how much of the image is exposed at a given time. So you want to avoid shutter. You want to avoid, they can see it here, kind of movement. You go faster. ISO, you want to put it as low as possible to avoid noise. Now we go to aperture. Aperture is kind of, for me, took me time. I'm going to be honest, it took me time to understand the concept of it. This is where you get more into the physics and into the science of photography, because there's so many things going on inside the lens and the way light hits the lens and goes into the sensor. You have reflection. You have all these things that seriously, this is what really got me into photography, the science of it. And this is a lens, as simple as it looks, is such an accomplishment in science and technology that it's incredible. But basically, what is the effect of how much it's opened or closed to the image? It's several things. We understand that the more open it is, the more light hits the sensor. So if we want to control the light, we close it up. But the way cameras use this, the numbers are kind of like backwards to our heads. You would think the more open the hole is, the bigger the hole is, the bigger the number it should be. But actually, it's backwards. And I'll explain to you why. We measure aperture in what is called f-stops. F-stops. F-stops is a measurement in light in photography. I'm not going to go too deep into it because, like I said, I don't want to bore you guys with the science of it all. But we call it f-stops. You would say a lens with an aperture at a moment of f2 versus a lens with an aperture at a moment of f22. One would assume in your head, because you would say f22 is smaller. F2 is smaller than f22. So the hole in the lens should be smaller at f2 than in f22. But it's actually backwards. And this had me stumped for a long time because I never came across an answer that would satisfy me as to why this would be the case. And I'll give you an example. This lens, at its widest opening, which is right now, is at f4 for this lens, because each lens is built a bit differently, and the bigger the lens, the more the relation of the f number is, but that's a different story for a different day. But for this moment, right now, this is at f4. If I put it to f22, it's at f4 right now. And that's f22. And I would be like, but wait a minute, the hole is smaller. Shouldn't that be f4? And shouldn't this be f22? Because this is bigger, this is smaller. This is bigger, this is smaller. But somebody explained this to me the correct way, and it made sense in my head. I may be wrong, and that person may have explained to me wrong, but in my head it made so much sense that I understand it perfectly, and now I can control how I use it to my advantage. So don't take me to the bank with what I'm about to explain, but this is how it was explained to me, and it makes sense to me. When you measure the f or the aperture, you don't measure from the inside out. So that's f4. That's f22. You would think that that number means how small the hole is, or how large the hole is. But actually, what you're measuring is how much is covered and how much is open. So you see the little blades that are closing, kind of like the James Bond thing, which is basically what the James Bond thing is, an aperture blade. The more the aperture blades cover the hole, that is the f-stop number. Right now, the aperture blades are at f4. This is more aperture blades, so that's f8 per se. f16, f22. Why? Because you measure from the outside in, and the more it's covered, the smaller the hole, but you're talking about how much coverage is in. So I hope that makes sense. I'm gonna make a drawing of it. Pardon me. So when it's here, it's at f4. Only that little bit is covered of the lens. When it's covered more, it's at f8. Double that is f16. Double that, f32. So it's at f4. You cover double that amount. f8. You cover double that amount. f16. You cover that over that amount. f32. And that's how you measure aperture. So when somebody says you want to have more light in, you have to make the hole bigger. You have to have the number smaller. You want less of the lens inside to be covered by the aperture blade, and that's why you have a lesser number. f4, f16, so forth. Again, look that up. There's so much information out there about that. This is the way it was explained to me that made sense in my head. Some people say it's different because it has these coefficients and these numbers and these other things, and it's too much math for me. I'm not that smart. This made sense to me. So the number depends on how much of the lens is covered by the aperture blades. What effect does the aperture have on the image itself? Apart from letting in more or less light, the larger the aperture is, the larger the aperture is, the more, well, the larger the aperture is, the less things you would have in focus in front of the lens at a certain distance. That makes crazy sense. Then it's going to be something that I will have to explain, but here it goes. The more the aperture is, the wider the aperture is, the less things in focus you would have in front of you at a certain distance. F4. Seen this way, this much would be in focus. F8, at the same distance, this much would be in focus. Okay, so at F4, if the camera's here at F4 and your subject is at this distance, this much would be in focus from here to here, from here to here. Everything behind it and everything in front of it would be out of focus. If you take the same photo at F8 from the same camera and the same distance, this would be in focus from here to here, from here to here. Everything behind this will be out of focus. Everything in front of this would be out of focus. This is due, and again, I'm a science nerd, I'm a science crazy person, and I like to look up why the things happen. So if you want, look this up, and it's extremely, extremely, extremely interesting. It's because of a phenomenon with lenses called the circle of confusion. It's called the circle of confusion. I don't have the expert techniques or the science ability to explain it to you well, but there's so many videos online about it, and it's super interesting to find out, because even our eyes do that at an extent, not as much as lenses, but at an extent. But it's called the circle of confusion, and in basic, what it is. Try to explain it. This is light coming in and hit the lens. As it comes in, it converges and flips and goes to the sensor. As we saw in the video of the Cámara Oscura, light comes into the room, and then you see the upside down image on the other side. That's what happens with the lens because of that. Now, how big and how small the aperture is will let in a certain amount of the size of that light, and anything beyond that light will come in blurry. So the bigger it is, okay, everything is blurry. But when you invert that backwards, that big one becomes smaller. It's hard to explain with my hands. Becomes smaller. So more things are the opposite. So more things are blurry. That's the way I understand it. So, but go in, look at what circle of confusion, and it's very, very exciting. So when you see those images, especially of portraits of people, where you see them really clear, and then in the back it's blurry, and the front is blurry, and people go like, "Ooh, that's so, your camera is so good that it does that. That must be such an expensive camera that it does that." And you have the iPhones and the Google Pixels and all the Android phones and everything doing that portrait filter where it takes the photo and then blurs everything back because it wants to do that. That's all controllable with the aperture of the lens. It's all science. There's art to it. Don't get me wrong. There's art to it, but it's all science. And once you understand the concept of that, and that's how you can control how much you want in focus in that image, controlling the aperture. So we go back to the triangle of the exposure. If you want to control how much is in focus, if you want to control how much is blurred and how much is not, and you want to control how much you want to boost the sensor or not, you take all three and you can control what your final image is going to be. If I want a photo of someone static, sharp, without movement, I do a fast shutter, and I say I want them to be the ones in focus, and I want everything behind them and in front of them not in focus. Fast shutter, a wide open aperture, and then I just put the ISO as low as possible to control that light. If I want a photo where I want everything in focus from the beginning all the way to the back, I close the aperture as much as possible. Less light will come in. I would have to decide how much shutter speed I want and how much ISO I want. So these are the three things you control to make the proper photo: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Sorry, I keep hitting the microphone. I recommend that everyone go and review some videos online. There's a lot of good videos out there on to explain each one in depth and in detail. But those are the three main things you would do to control how to expose, how to take a proper photo. And each camera has a way of doing that, even your cell phone. So let's see, what time is it? It's 12. We've been here an hour, and I believe I bored you guys too much. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask me. I'm going to take the next 5 minutes to get some questions responded. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Okay. Like an old teacher I used to have in school used to say, either everybody understood everything or nobody understood nothing. There's no questions. And in this case, I think I explained it bad. I think nobody understood anything. Okay. So we're going to go and do a quick section. Hope everybody's still here. I don't know how many people there still are. I have 4 people. Okay. Okay. So we're going to go into the, can I ask a question about photography that you didn't go over? Sure. Ask. We're going to go to another purpose. Go ahead. Ask. I would like all the questions you would like to ask. waiting for the question to be asked. Okay, so in the meantime, while the question comes through, like I said, it takes a moment between what I see and how it's sent it out, then comes back to me. We're gonna go through. Okay, so aperture, ISO, shutter speed. Went through the technical stuff. I think I spent too much time on it, but that's okay. Now we're gonna go to the actual photo taking process. And this is where more of the art part goes in. When you take a photo, there are things to consider. We already went through the technical part. Now we're going to go more into the artistic part. And the artistic part is what's called the composition. Composition is, as the term says, you compose your image. A lot of photos are stuff that are random, that you just stop it at the moment. But most photos, you take the time, see the subject, and compose it and set it up the way you want to do it at the end. There are certain rules of composition. Now, these rules are more guidelines than anything else, because in art, as in a lot of things, you have your guidelines, but ultimately you can break these rules and do as you please. But why break the rules not knowing them is something I don't understand. If you want to break the rules, you have to understand which rules you're breaking them and why. Okay, this is Cyrus. I'm Des' oldest son, and I want to get a good camera that's not a ton of money, but still that's good one. A beginner that can use a good quality. What camera would I suggest? Okay, that's a very good question. I don't suggest buying something specific, because I don't believe that there's a better brand or better model or better camera one over the other. I do believe, though, that you should get what you can afford that's best at the moment for you. How can I explain that? You can buy yourself a $5,000 camera that has the latest sensor, the latest Filmajigs, and the latest whatever, and say, I got this 5,000 camera. But that doesn't mean you're going to take better photos than the person that just bought a $400 camera. Because ultimately, it comes down to how you use the tool, not what the tool is. Now, mind you, if you have two people that are just as qualified using the same equipment, using a better camera might give them an edge on certain things, but ultimately, it's how you use the tool. So, I would say the first thing you have to do is, how much money do you have and are you willing to spend? B, what is your end game? If you just want to use it as a hobby and learn from it, and then from there probably grow into it, then I would suggest getting something with, especially these days, prosumer mid-level mirrorless camera. Something like the Canon RP, something like the Sony A6400, something like the Nikon Z5, I believe it is, or even Panasonic GS5. All of these are cameras that will give you what you're looking for at a good price. I wouldn't say stay away from DSLRs and go straight into mirrorless, because they're still producing DSLRs, but the way of the future is going towards mirrorless, so why not just have something that's gonna prepare you for the future? I don't know what your budget is, but something in that. Now, I always suggest beginners and starters and young people to shop around and see if they can find themselves a good deal used. You just take into consideration, it's like buying a used car. It might look fine in the outside, but the motor might be bad. So you have to ask good questions and get good information. DSLRs, like this one, you want to know how many, what they call the shutter count is on the camera before you buy it used. What is the shutter count? Let me go here. That's the mirror. And once that takes that, you take the photo, it opens, you have the shutter, which I showed you on the other camera. The shutter is behind there. Every time you take a photo, that shutter opens and closes. That is a mechanical process. That's not electronic, that's mechanical. The shutter has to move. There's mechanical parts to it. The more it opens and closes, the more times it does it, the more use it gets, and eventually it will fail. It will. Eventually it will fail because it's a mechanical part. You can have two cameras, the same model, same date of making and everything, one after the other from the factory. This one will fail at 100,000 photos, while the one behind it will fail at 50,000 photos. So the least amount of photos taken with the camera is how you measure how much more you can get out of it. It's like a car. The less mileage it has, even if it's an older car, if it has very few miles, I would pick that one over probably a newer one with crazy amount of mileage. The camera, once it starts taking photo, it has a memory inside. Even if it has because it has like a little built-in battery, like the computers, and it keeps track of that. So if somebody's selling you a camera used, you can ask them for what is called the shutter count. And all they have to do is connect the camera to a computer. There's software for that. The software itself on so much of the camera manufacturer software does it, or else you get a third-party software. And it tells you how many photos it has taken. What's the shutter count? The lower the shutter count, the more inclined I would to buy that camera or not. Apart from the physical aspects of it being, chipped or whatever. You don't want the screen chipped or anything like that, or the screen inside or the mirror chipped. And the sensor, you want the sensor to be clean. But the shutter is the most important thing to take into consideration when buying a used camera. Mirrorless cameras, the newer mirrorless cameras, also have a shutter. There's a misconception that mirrorless cameras don't have a shutter. They do have a shutter, and they do have a shutter count too. So, because I've been asked that question before, people ask me, "Oh, I'm gonna get a mirrorless camera. It doesn't matter how old it is because the shutter doesn't use that much shutter." I'm like, yes, it does. It's the same. It just doesn't have a mirror, which is totally different. So that I gave you a long circle to the response, but what's the good camera? There's no specific answer. It's what fits your budget. What's the best thing you can buy with your budget? If it's used, it would be something with a low shutter count that would get you to what you want to do without you breaking the bank. And if it's newer, I would go to something in the mirrorless family, like the Canon RP. That's a good one. Like the Sony A6400, I believe, or 6500 is the new one. You can even get an older A6300. and that I hope that answered your questions. Okay, if anybody else has any other questions. Okay, so let's see here. It's been an hour and a half. I think this has been good for today. We're gonna do another chat, another live feed, hopefully next week. I want to do it next Friday, most likely, and we're gonna go into what is composition itself. If you have any questions on like what cameras to buy or what model or anything that you have about your own camera, feel free to ask me. No worry, man. Thank you, Cyrus, for being a part. Thank your mom for having you here with us. Like I said, we're gonna do again next week. We're gonna go through composition, rule of thirds, lines, following lines, leading lines, and all that to get better photos. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you so much for being a part. I know we're living in kind of like crazy times right now, and it's kind of weird, but we want to make the best of it. We want to be part of the community, and there's a phrase I like to say it in Spanish, because in Spanish it makes more sense to me. Dar por gracia lo que por gracia has recibido. That's give back by grace, but what by grace you have received. I believe that what I know, the little that I know, as much as I know, has been given to me by grace, by God, and I want to give it back always to the community. So I'm always out here to help. You can see my Instagram thing there at Mario Ramirez Photography. If you would like, give me a follow and just send me any questions you have there. I'm always open to answer questions, not just while I'm doing the live feed, but always. So see you guys next Friday at 11 a.m. Bring your questions. Ask your friends to join us. In the meantime, give us a follow. Mario Ramirez Photography. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Peace, love, and be blessed. Thank you.